Last week, you met a father, his wife, and his ex-wife, and they told you how they were able to lay down their arms and work together to cooperatively co-parent the child they share between them. They were truly an exceptional family. Unfortunately, it's far more common that divorcing parents are unable to stop bickering and to work together to make decisions about their children. Often they cannot agree at all, and someone else has to be called in to make decisions for them. That's who we'll be talking to today on Fathers Are Parents Too. I'm here today with author Dr. Philip Stahl, and Dr. Stahl is a child custody evaluator and the author of the book Conducting Child Custody Evaluations. Dr. Stahl, a child custody evaluation, what does that mean exactly?
Well, basically, Anne, what happens is a family who can't agree between themselves on custody for their children. They usually go through mediation, they still can't agree. The court will appoint an evaluator to do a custody evaluation to try and help the family come to their own understanding of what their children need. The evaluator will make recommendations to the court and to the family, and hopefully this will get the family better prepared to reach an agreement that works for their children. If they can't do that, because the court has the evaluation, the court will then make a determination of what's best for the children.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is then this is another step in the process where arguing parents can make a decision together if they're able to, but if they can't, then as the evaluator, your role is to, do you actually make that determination for them?
Well, what we do is we make recommendations to the parents and to the court. Evaluators can't make the final decisions. Judges are the only ones that can do that. But I think most of us believe that parents are the ones who should be raising their children. It shouldn't be the courts, it shouldn't be the evaluators. What we try to do is provide enough information to the parents so the parents can make thoughtful decisions for what their children need after they get divorced.
And yet you're called an evaluator, and that tells me that you're looking at something and actually evaluating certain criteria, I would assume, to decide or help the court decide if the parents can't, who the child should live with.
Right.
What sort of criteria are you looking at that point?
We're basically looking at several factors. One of those factors is the parenting ability of each parent. How well they understand the children's needs, how well they can communicate with the children, how well they can communicate with each other. Because sometimes what we're looking for is this a couple who might want to be able to share the parenting or have one parent as a primary parent. If they can't communicate at all, if they can't work it out, or if they live too far from each other, some form of shared parenting may be more difficult than something where parents are relatively equal in their time with the kids. So we're going to be looking at the parenting ability, how the parents can communicate with each other, also the individual psychological functioning of each parent. Research is going to show that the parent's ability to function as an adult is one of the key factors in how well children adjust. And if we have a psychologically unhealthy parent, that's important to understand when we're looking at who should be the custodial parent.
Now, most evaluators, I think, or certainly you are a PhD psychologist,
Correct.
So they have the ability to make those judgment calls, at least presumably speaking. Are there evaluators who are not psychologists, or is that sort of uniquely that realm?
There are mental health professionals who aren't psychologists that do evaluations. They can't do psychological testing as part of the evaluations, but there might be MFCCs or LCSWs, marriage, family, child counselors, licensed clinical social workers that are also doing evaluations. Usually for the evaluators who aren't trained and able to do psychological testing, if they feel or the court feels that psychological testing is needed, they'll refer that part of the evaluation to a psychologist.
So does that mean that you said you look and see whether a parent is emotionally healthy? Does that mean throughout this evaluation process you might also be providing therapeutic services to these parents to try and repair some sort of unhealthy situation?
An evaluator's role is a very unique role, and all of the organizations that have decided on ethical guidelines for how to do an evaluation make it very clear that an evaluator is only an evaluator. We don't do therapy, we don't do mediation, we don't do parent education or those kinds of things to a family when we're doing an evaluation. In fact, if we've been a therapist of anyone in the family before the family goes to evaluation, we're ethically bound not to do an evaluation with that family. This is relatively new. The guidelines have come out, national guidelines from the American Psychological Association or another group, the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. But people in the last several years have recognized that this is very important to keep that boundary separate. So evaluators are only doing evaluations.
So in essence then, are you supposed to be sort of like a neutral third party, sort of like the UN, and they're observing, reporting your observations, but not necessarily trying to change any of the situations you find? But isn't it true, though, that the evaluators have an awful lot of power in as much as what they recommend to the court usually is, as I understand it, what the court will order? Is that...
In a lot of situations, that is exactly the case, that if the parents can't agree after the evaluation is done, the court will pretty well order the recommendations to be put into place. And if they can't go along with it, then they can still try and get a trial to try and change it. But that's really very difficult to do. It costs a lot of money. And I think the other thing is that even in trial, most often the outcome of the trial is that the evaluator's recommendations go into place, unless an evaluator has not done a thorough job or there's been some real problems in the evaluation process. You mentioned something about that it's an unbiased, neutral person. Until about 5 years ago, what you'd see is a family mom would hire her own evaluator, dad would hire his own evaluator. They come into court, they come in with two different sets of recommendations. The judges wouldn't know what to do. In California, there's a procedure called, or part of the court rules is to stipulate an expert for the court. And evaluators who are stipulated as an expert for the court is a neutral evaluator, and that one evaluator is evaluating everybody in the family. So that ideally, this is someone who's had no contact with anybody, they're not hired by either side, so the recommendations they make are neutral, and they're for the family, for the child, and for the best interest of the child or children.
Well, now, we're talking about choosing often between mom and dad or maybe grandparents who the child will live with as the outcome of this evaluation.
Correct.
So even though, in theory, the evaluator is supposed to be neutral, isn't it the case really that pretty much everyone has their own biases as to where a child should be or who should be home with the child? And how can you account for that?
I think that most evaluators do have certain biases. We have our own personal experiences. We have an understanding of maybe what makes a good parent. We certainly have a bias a lot of times of what kinds of factors work for joint custody as opposed to one primary parent. And if you talk to different evaluators, they may have different biases in some direction. The critical component is for an evaluator to know and understand his or her own biases, to be honest about them, at least within him or herself. If attorneys ask about the biases, to share those biases, to be very careful that they fit within the law. If somebody has a bias, for example, that children need to be at home with their mothers when they're 3 years of age, and mothers have a primary custodial role, the law is different than that. The law says it's gender neutral. And an evaluator needs to be real clear if that's the reason for a recommendation, that it's based on his or her biases.
So what can a parent do then if, say, the evaluator has been very honest about their biases, which I would think would put them out of business? So I'm very hard-pressed to believe that an evaluator would come out openly and say, gee, you know, I'm against people with red hair or whatever their bias may be. Mm-hmm. If a parent feels that they have received an evaluation that may have been tainted by this bias, particularly if it's admitted bias, at that point, what can they do? Because you've told us this is the court's expert, so it's not like they can just fire them, I'm assuming. What would you recommend someone do in that situation?
Well, first of all, I think that it's in fact the exact opposite. If someone tells the attorneys and the parents about a bias, and in fact they come out in favor of the direction of the bias, there's going to be some very clear-cut reason why that is that's different than their bias. They're going to have to very clearly spell out the reasons for this particular family, why it went in that direction. I tend to have a bias, for example, in terms of parents trying to share parenting in some fashion after their divorce. Both parents, the best parent essentially is two parents, and both parents is a bias that I hold. There are lots of times I make recommendations of a primary parent, certainly when I make that recommendation and it goes against a basic bias that I hold, there's going to be some very clear and understandable reasons why I've made that recommendation. On the other hand, if I make a recommendation in the favor or the direction of the bias, I'm still going to put in my evaluation report the reasons for that particular family that it fits, not because of my bias, but because of that family. So the critical piece there is sharing enough information with the family and with the attorneys in the court to explain our reason for the recommendations that we make. And then it's clear, hopefully, that it has nothing to do with our bias. In terms of the other part of your question, what can the family do? Certainly before an evaluator is agreed upon, usually 3 names are put out by the court, and people can pick or talk to the evaluators and get an idea of what the evaluator is like, what the costs are going to be, those kinds of things. If they can agree on the evaluator then, great, that person's set, there's no problem. If the 2 attorneys can agree and the parents can agree, and if they know the biases ahead of time, there's really little problem there.
And I would assume another thing that parents should do before picking or working with an evaluator is pick up a copy of your book. Is that this is written for parents as well as evaluators, correct?
It's written mostly for evaluators and judges and attorneys. Certainly I've talked to parents who have found it a valuable guide in understanding what the evaluation process is going to be all about. And because very much in that book it focuses a lot on the evaluation process, what to expect, how to understand some of the different roles the mental health people play in the divorce arena. It talks a bit about some of the developmental needs of children, how to look at that in terms of an evaluation. So it can be very helpful to parents, and I've had parents tell me that it's been very helpful.
Now, would it be appropriate and not taken as an accusation in any way for a parent to go to an evaluator and say, here, before you evaluate our family, would you please read this book? Would that be something that would be well received by most evaluators, do you think? Or
I don't know. I know that some evaluators don't like to have parents suggest to them what to do. A lot of times evaluators have an idea of how to do an evaluation, and they may not really like it if a parent comes to them and says, here, read this book. What an attorney may want to do, or what a parent may want to do, is ask the evaluator, how much experience do you have? How much have you read about the new information on doing evaluations? And that may be a place for an attorney or a parent to suggest reading the book. And that's certainly something the parents might want to do in that regard.
Now, you mentioned that this is written among other target audiences for judges, and I have talked to judges who have made it very clear that the last thing they want to do is make the decision as to who a child should live with or how the time between parents should be divided. And if you can briefly tell us, how do you feel about that? Because you know that what you're going to recommend is probably going to be implemented, and in a sense that's almost playing God with these children. And how does that affect you?
Sometimes it's very difficult. In cases where you have 2 very good parents, both of whom look as if they could do a good job of being primary parent or sharing the parenting, but logistics, like somebody lives in Northern California and somebody lives in Southern California, it's very, very difficult in that situation to decide what's going to happen for this child. In situations where you have 2 very relatively unfit parents, and it's difficult to figure out what's the least of bad alternatives, is sometimes a difficult thing for me as well. By and large, by the time I'm done with an evaluation, though, the direction is pretty clear. And because my goal is to help children and to help their parents do a better job of parenting their children, it isn't that difficult for me to make recommendations. The hard ones especially is in the move-away situations where you have some very good reasons for moving. A company transfers somebody. Recently had a couple of evaluations where someone's in the military. The military, as everyone knows, is really not a family-friendly organization. And in many, many ways, this makes it very difficult. Those are the hardest ones. One of the recent ones, in fact, I did not make a recommendation at all.
Really?
And I left it back to the court using the legal guidelines. I don't think the judge was happy with me, but it really seemed to me that there was no psychological basis for making a decision, and it would have to be done on a legal, social basis. And that's outside my realm. And I think that it's important for evaluators when something is outside their realm to be very clear on that and say, we just don't know.
And we can't do it.
And we can't make that recommendation.
I think we have some questions from the audience now,
Okay.
so let's go over to them. Welcome back to Fathers Are Parents Too. We're here today with Dr. Philip Stahl, and we're at the audience, and we're going to get some questions from them for Dr. Stahl.
Yes, Dr. Stahl. When you're doing the evaluation process, how do you determine whether or not a parent is doing something that they don't normally do when relating to the children? In other words, they're role-playing because you're sitting there doing something, evaluating them, and they're on the hot seat. And they're not. That's not something they typically do when they're taking care of their children.
They're showing off.
They're showing off. They're really trying to look good. One of the reasons that I like using psychological tests as part of the evaluation process is it gives a broader range of information about each parent. The testing I do is with the parents, not with the children. And if they're trying to look good in their parenting, that quality of trying to look good will usually show up in the psychological tests. The other thing that happens is I've already heard all kinds of dirt about each parent from the other parent. And I'm going to be comparing what I'm hearing from each parent to what I'm observing in my office. It may be that the dirt is made up and not real. And again, I'm going to possibly find, or hopefully find something in the psychological testing that would suggest that someone is maybe exaggerative in the way they say things, or maybe a lot into denial, or whatever other factors I may find. And the key in the evaluation process is to compare all the different sorts of data that I have and try and make a whole picture out of it. A lot of times, one of the things that I find is that, I kind of see people out in the neighborhood when I go shopping or whatever, and I think to myself, this is where I should be evaluating people and able to see them because I can see them in real life. But what I found is that children act real life even in the evaluation process. So parents need to respond to whatever their children are doing. They can't play it that well. And so by comparing all the different pieces, by recognizing that children are natural, even in the evaluation process, that usually gives me the answers I need. I say usually because we're not perfect, just like judges aren't, just like parents aren't, but hopefully we're going to get the information we need.
Phil, what about the children when they have been coached by the parent? You say they're natural in the evaluation process, but certainly I've run into cases where the child has been told repeatedly by mommy or daddy, that the other parent has done a bad thing or that they're bad people and the child should be scared of them. And how can you cut through to that and know that the child's been coached, or can you?
Sometimes it's difficult, but I'm going to look at what the feeling state or the emotions are of the child when they're telling me things. If it doesn't fit, I'm going to wonder what that might be all about. A child who says he or she is really scared of mommy or daddy, and I see them together and they don't look scared at all, well, why were they telling me? The other thing is sometimes children will come in and first words out of their mouth is, daddy did such and so, or mommy did such and so. And it's like, why are you telling me this? I want to start with, hi, what's your name? Where do you go to school? Who are your friends? And there's something odd when a child comes in and starts right away with the same dirt that one of the parents has said. And then I begin to feel that, okay, there may be some coaching going on.
And will that backfire against the coaching parent?
Hopefully. In some way. Okay. It may be that the coaching parent is still the healthier parent, and what you want to do in the recommendations is try and get them to stop that process, but they still may be the healthier of the two parents. So we're, again, looking at a whole range of factors, and we don't just make recommendations about custody and visitation. We may make recommendations about the things that parents need to work on in therapy, things that relate to the parenting cooperation, how to get parents to co-parent together a little bit better. They all relate to the recommendations as well.
Okay. Yes.
It's my understanding that evaluators not only make determinations about custody situations, but they're called in to look at move-aways as well. And I think it must be very difficult in a move-away evaluation to evaluate a reality that you know all about, because it's where the children and the parents are presently living against a hypothetical reality that they're going to be moving to. In a case like that, do you think it'd be reasonable to perhaps defer an evaluation until after they've moved on some sort of temporary basis so that you can evaluate apples and apples?
I think that the job is to try and do whatever the family or the courts is asking us to do, and to do it very carefully. There are times when we're going to make a recommendation that we say and know is a temporary recommendation, and something should be reevaluated in 6 to 9 months, for example. And a move away may be one of those places. The problem is children shouldn't be experimental animals. They've got lives that are very real. Their lives go on. They have a need to truly be able to live their life. And waiting to do an evaluation until after a particular move or something may put them in a situation, one way or the other, if the child does or doesn't move with that parent, that's not necessarily the healthiest of situations. So it's real important to try and, if asked to do the evaluation at the beginning, to do that evaluation and to recognize that we can only see what we can see, and that potentially something may be different down the road after a move away. That's a tough one, though. The move aways are about the toughest of evaluations with every evaluator I know.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I have 2 questions. One is, what role does a stepmother play when you're evaluating the family situation? And the second question is, I often hear, what is in the best interest of the child? I continually get confused on how someone comes up with the definition of what is in the best interest of the child. I don't know if you can address that at all.
I'll try to address both. In terms of step-parents, again, a lot of times it's dependent on the order and or the agreement about the evaluation. Sometimes very much we're supposed to see step-parents. There may be questions about the step-parent and their role in the parenting, or their role in some allegation of abuse, let's say, toward a child. To the extent that the order says we should evaluate step-parents, we absolutely will do that. If it's not specified, my own way of doing it is to see the biological parents first in the process, and then halfway through the process include step-parents as well, to not only hear their side, hear their thoughts. It's amazing to me sometimes how often a step-parent says things in an evaluation that's actually more critical of their spouse than of the other parent, because they tend to be more neutral. Step-parents. A lot of times step-parents are really more focused on the children than the biological parents are, and the children's needs. So I think including the step-parent is very important. The extent to which the step-parent is included is completely connected to the order and the issues that are involved. Let me try to answer the other one real quickly in terms of the best interest of the child. That's defined by the law and by the definitions in the law, by the legislature, and it varies from state to state, and it tends to vary over time. What I find as an evaluator is we've often got competing best interests. You sometimes have 2 children, or you have families where they've got blended families and you've got new children with new siblings. Whose best interests are we talking about? And I try to put it in a hierarchy in which we can understand as much as we can and make the best decisions that make sense for that child. But the concept of best interest is in the law.
Okay, we have time for one more quick question, maybe a 1-minuter.
Okay, Doctor, I've recently been through an evaluation last month, and now there's going to be a trial. It'll probably take about 6 months or so. Is this sort of typical that it might take a while before the evaluation recommendations are implemented? And what's your involvement, particularly while this interim period is going on, if any?
Let me just ask, as I understood you to say earlier, if the evaluation is accepted, there wouldn't be a trial. Is that correct? So it
That
sounds
is
like
correct.
someone's contesting it then. Is that?
Yeah, it's still before the court, though, and so it'll still be discussed. But
Do
you have an involvement at that point, though?
2 things can happen. Certainly one of them is that the evaluation recommendations can be put into effect on a temporary basis, or it's put on hold. And that's made a determination by the judge. During the process, while it's on hold, whether it's gone into effect or not, usually the evaluator has no role whatsoever. Again, we're just an evaluator, nothing more. By the time it comes to trial, the evaluator's role usually will be to testify at the trial in terms of his or her recommendations. The only other thing is if it's been put on hold or if the trial is as long as 6 months to a year later, the court may ask for an updated brief assessment by the evaluator just prior to trial to see what may have changed. But typically those are the places that the evaluator would get involved, if any, until trial.
Now, when we were talking before the show started, you mentioned that you do not only child custody evaluations, you also do special master work, and you also have your own private practice as well. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And if people wanted to take advantage of your services or just contact you or order your book, where would they find you?
I'm in Dublin. And
Ireland?
No, California. Dublin is right by the 580-680 intersection.
Okay.
And my phone number is 510-828-7660. And that's the best way to reach me.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to repeat that again more slowly. This is going out all across the country, so some people may already be stuck at the area code.
510-828-7660.
Okay, and in the 30 seconds we have left, can you tell me the nutshell version, special master, what does that mean?
A special master is almost like a judge in that, and a parent educator, and an evaluator, and a therapist, and many other things. What a special master does is tries to help the parents work together on behalf of their child, and when they can't do it, maybe mediation, maybe, again, as I said, parent education is a big part of it, make decisions quickly and avoiding court and staying out of the high cost and the high emotional side as well in the court battles, and working together for co-parenting their children.
Okay, so that means that you as the special master do that education or counseling?
I might. If it's counseling, I'll usually refer to another therapist, but in terms of the parent education, a lot of times I'll do that.
Okay, and otherwise you're just making orders. Is that, I'm basing again on what you said earlier, that
ultimately it comes down to a lot of times making orders. I like to do a lot of parent education as well.
sounds like a lot of them really need it.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. And again, the book is Conducting Child Custody Evaluations, and the author is Dr. Philip Stahl, and he is in Dublin, not Ireland, but California, and the number was 510
828
828
7660.
And can they get the book from the bookstore, or do they need to order it directly from you?
Directly from the publisher, actually. It's Sage Publications.
Sage Publications. Is
Or
that in Dublin?
contact me. No, that's in Southern California.
And they're listed just in Southern California?
They're in, I think, Thousand Oaks.
Thousand Oaks,
That area.
California. All right. Well, thank you very much for being here, and thank you all for attending. And be sure to join us next week when our topic will be gay parenting here on Fathers Are Parents Too.